Don't waste another minute arguing, we're already out of time. The words cut through the emergency operations center like a crack of thunder before the storm had even reached the South Carolina coast. Every conversation stopped. Television cameras turned. Reporters lowered their microphones. On the largest weather screen in the room, Hurricane Evelyn continued spinning over the Atlantic, its massive cloud bands stretching for hundreds of miles beyond the horizon. Captain Marcus Reed stood beside the digital map in the dark blue uniform of the United States Coast Guard, one weathered hand resting against the briefing table, while the other pointed toward a narrow line of warm ocean water that most people in the room barely noticed. His calm voice never rose above a steady command. The hurricane has shifted 12 miles west in the last 45 minutes. If that trend continues, Charleston Harbor won't take a glancing hit. It'll take the eye. Silence followed for barely a heartbeat before Mayor Richard Collins leaned back in his leather chair with a smile that carried more confidence than concern. "Captain Reed," he said, folding his hands as camera shutters clicked across the room, "our meteorologists disagree." Marcus didn't move. 27 years on the water had taught him that panic solved nothing. He had watched storms build from gentle swells into walls of black water taller than houses. He had rescued fishermen drifting through 40-foot waves, families trapped beneath collapsed docks, and tourists who underestimated tides that locals respected. He had earned medals that remained locked inside a drawer because, to him, every rescue belonged to the entire crew, not one man. What worried him now wasn't his reputation. It was the thousands of families preparing for the Charleston Harbor Festival only a few miles away. Colorful tents already lined Waterfront Park. Food vendors filled the streets with the smell of barbecue and roasted corn. Children laughed beneath banners fluttering in the humid breeze, while musicians tested speakers on a stage facing the harbor. More than 200,000 visitors were expected before sunset. None of them knew the ocean had begun whispering a different story. Marcus reached for the remote and enlarged the satellite image until a faint ribbon of unusually warm water glowed orange against the deep blue Atlantic. "This current is feeding the southern eye wall," he explained. "If it keeps strengthening, the storm won't stay on the forecast track." A young reporter raised her hand. "Captain, are you saying the National Hurricane Center is wrong?" Marcus answered without hesitation. "I'm saying hurricanes don't care about predictions. They respond to conditions." Before another question could be asked, Mayor Collins stood and stepped in front of the cameras with practiced confidence. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "Charleston has prepared for storms for generations. Our emergency experts have everything under control, and the Harbor Festival will continue as scheduled." A few reporters nodded. Others scribbled notes. One television producer whispered to another while glancing toward Marcus with visible skepticism. Then the mayor looked directly at him. "Captain Reed, I appreciate your passion, but your responsibility begins after disasters happen, not before. Leave forecasting to the scientists." A ripple of restrained laughter moved through several officials standing near the back wall. Marcus heard every quiet chuckle. He also noticed Lieutenant Daniel Brooks, the youngest officer on his rescue team, standing near the doorway with concern written across his face. Daniel knew that expression on his captain's face. It appeared only when instinct and experience pointed in the same direction. Marcus slowly lowered the remote onto the conference table. His eyes drifted beyond the windows overlooking Charleston Harbor, where the afternoon sunlight shimmered across deceptively peaceful water. Fishing boats rocked gently at their slips. Seagulls circled above the marina. Tourists snapped photographs beneath bright blue skies. Nothing looked dangerous. That was exactly what unsettled him. The ocean often smiled before it roared. He drew one quiet breath, meeting the mayor's confident gaze without anger. "Mr. Mayor," he said evenly, "I hope I'm wrong." Then he turned toward the exit as every camera in the room followed him, unaware that the first invisible change in the wind had already begun somewhere far beyond the horizon. Captain Marcus Reed walked through the Coast Guard station without looking back at the reporters gathering outside the gates. Their questions echoed behind him, but none of them slowed his pace. He had spent nearly 3 decades learning that recognition faded quickly while responsibility never did. The station overlooked Charleston Harbor, where rows of orange rescue boats rested quietly against the docks, their hulls rising and falling with the gentle afternoon tide. The salty breeze carried the familiar scent of seawater, diesel fuel, and weathered wood, a combination Marcus had known since childhood. He paused for only a moment, studying the horizon where the sky still appeared calm enough to fool almost anyone. Almost anyone except those who had trusted the ocean with their lives. Lieutenant Daniel Brooks hurried after him, carrying a stack of updated weather reports beneath one arm. "Captain, the city just released another statement. They are telling everyone the festival is safe." Marcus accepted the papers without breaking stride. "I expected that." Daniel hesitated before speaking again. "Do you think they believed you at all?" Marcus gave a faint smile that never quite reached his eyes. "Belief is not something I can control. Preparation is." Those words reflected the lesson his father had repeated throughout Marcus's childhood on the small fishing boat they worked every summer. His father, Samuel Reed, had never trusted a bright sky more than a changing tide. "The ocean does not announce when it wants respect," he used to say. "It simply takes it." Marcus carried those words through every year of service. At 46 years old, his uniform displayed rows of commendations earned during hurricanes, floods, and countless rescue missions stretching from the Carolinas to the Gulf Coast. Yet the award he valued most had never been pinned to his chest. It was the quiet handshake from families who had gone home because his crew arrived before hope disappeared. Inside the operations room, large digital maps covered one wall while radios filled the air with routine Coast Guard traffic. Petty Officer Elena Martinez looked up from the communications desk as Marcus entered. "Captain, Station Georgetown reported stronger than expected swells. They are asking if we are increasing readiness." Marcus nodded immediately. "Move every rescue boat to full fuel capacity. Inspect every helicopter. Double-check medical supplies. I want every crew member ready to deploy within 15 minutes." Elena looked surprised. Even without an evacuation order? Marcus met her eyes with complete certainty, especially without one. Around the room, experienced rescue specialists exchanged brief glances before silently getting to work. None of them questioned the order. They had sailed beside Marcus through too many storms to mistake caution for fear. Daniel unfolded another weather chart across the briefing table. "Captain, every national model still shows the eye staying offshore." Marcus traced a finger across the latest satellite image before stopping at the same narrow band of unusually warm water. "The models are looking at where the storm has been. I am looking at what it has become." Daniel followed his finger across the screen. "You really think it is going to turn?" Marcus stared through the window toward the distant Atlantic. "I have seen water this warm only 3 times in my career. Every one of those storms surprised someone." Outside, church bells rang across downtown Charleston as visitors continued filling the historic streets. Families laughed beneath colorful banners, while musicians rehearsed for the evening concert along the waterfront. Restaurants welcomed long lines of tourists eager to enjoy the celebration before the weather changed. On television screens inside hotel lobbies, local anchors repeated the mayor's reassuring message, while briefly showing a clip of Marcus leaving the press conference. One commentator smiled politely before saying, "Fortunately, city leadership is relying on the official forecast rather than isolated opinions." Daniel quietly turned off the television mounted above the operations desk. The room became still except for the steady rhythm of radios and computer alerts. Marcus removed his cap and placed it carefully beside the maps. He could feel the pressure changing long before any instrument confirmed it. Somewhere beyond the horizon, invisible winds were beginning to write a different ending than the one the city had chosen to believe. Without raising his voice, he looked at every member of his team and spoke with the calm confidence that had carried them through countless rescues before. "We prepare today because tomorrow may not give us the chance." Across Charleston, preparation looked remarkably different inside City Hall. The marble hallways echoed with polished shoes, cheerful conversations, and the steady rhythm of people convinced they had already won against the weather. Mayor Richard Collins stood before a massive wall display showing the Harbor Festival schedule, smiling as tourism officials celebrated record attendance projections. Hotel reservations had reached their highest level in years. Restaurants expected every table to be filled before sunset. Television stations promoted the waterfront concert as the highlight of the holiday weekend. To the mayor, canceling the festival was no longer a question of public safety. It had become a question of reputation, campaign promises, and millions of dollars flowing into the local economy. Deputy Mayor Susan Whitaker stepped into the conference room carrying a fresh folder of financial reports. "If we shut everything down now," she said quietly, "the city could lose nearly $30 million this weekend alone." Richard barely looked up before answering. "And if we keep everything open?" Susan smiled. "We look confident. Strong leadership always photographs well." Several council members nodded around the polished oak table. One of them adjusted his tie before saying, "People are tired of unnecessary warnings. They want normal life back." Another official added, "The latest forecast still keeps the worst winds offshore. We cannot scare everyone because one Coast Guard captain has a different opinion." Laughter circled the room. Richard walked toward the tall windows overlooking Charleston Harbor. From 20 floors above the streets, the city appeared almost perfect. White boats drifted peacefully through the marina. Historic church steeples reflected golden afternoon sunlight. Families wandered through the waterfront marketplace, carrying shopping bags and ice cream cones, while children pointed excitedly toward colorful festival decorations fluttering in the breeze. It was the image every mayor wanted the nation to see. A communications advisor entered carrying a tablet. "Sir, local news wants another interview. They are asking about Captain Reed's warning." Richard sighed with visible impatience. "Schedule it." Minutes later, bright studio lights illuminated the temporary media stage outside City Hall. Reporters gathered shoulder to shoulder as microphones stretched toward the mayor. One journalist spoke first. "Mr. Mayor, Captain Marcus Reed believes the hurricane could strike Charleston directly. Why are you rejecting his recommendation?" Richard smiled with practiced ease. "Because leadership requires facts, not fear. We respect every member of the Coast Guard, but emergency planning follows scientific consensus, not individual instincts." Another reporter quickly asked, "Captain Reed has 27 years of rescue experience. Does that concern you?" Richard answered without hesitation. "Experience on rescue boats does not automatically make someone a hurricane scientist." Several officials standing behind him exchanged satisfied smiles, while camera shutters clicked continuously. The interview aired live across South Carolina within minutes. At the Coast Guard station, Daniel Brooks watched the broadcast in silence before slowly lowering the volume. Elena Martinez folded her arms. That was unnecessary. Marcus remained focused on reviewing fuel inventories without turning toward the screen. "We do not control what people say." Daniel looked frustrated. He practically questioned your judgment in front of the entire state. Marcus finally looked up from the paperwork. His expression remained calm, but there was quiet disappointment behind his steady eyes. "Daniel, storms are not interested in winning arguments. Neither am I." The room fell silent once again. Outside, a humid wind brushed across the docks with slightly more force than it had only an hour earlier. Small ripples became restless waves against the pilings. A flock of seabirds lifted suddenly into the gray sky before changing direction all at once, flying inland instead of following the shoreline. Marcus noticed immediately. He stepped outside onto the pier, resting one hand against the weathered railing as he watched the birds disappear over the rooftops of Charleston. Behind him, the harbor remained filled with music, laughter, and celebration. Ahead of him, somewhere beyond the horizon where the Atlantic met the darkening sky, the storm had quietly begun writing a future that no press conference could erase. The sun slipped lower over Charleston Harbor, casting long bands of amber light across the water, but Captain Marcus Reed saw something entirely different from everyone else watching the beautiful evening unfold. The wind no longer arrived in steady patterns. It came in uncertain breaths, changing direction for only a few seconds before settling again. The tide was running faster than it should have been, pushing floating markers slightly inland even though the official forecast insisted the storm would remain well offshore. Marcus stood beside the navigation chart spread across the operations table, while Lieutenant Daniel Brooks compared fresh satellite images against the earlier reports. Every update seemed small by itself, but together they painted a picture that refused to leave Marcus's mind. Elena Martinez entered carrying another packet of weather data from a neighboring Coast Guard station. "Captain, Savannah just reported sea surface temperatures nearly 3 degrees higher than expected. They thought you should see this." Marcus studied the numbers without speaking. After several quiet moments, He reached for a marker and circled the narrow corridor of warm water stretching toward Charleston. "This is it," he said softly. Daniel leaned closer. "You think this is enough to change the storm?" Marcus nodded once. "Warm water is fuel. The hurricane has been looking for more energy, and it just found it." Daniel looked toward the harbor through the station windows where families continued strolling beneath colorful festival banners. "Then we have to convince City Hall." Marcus folded the weather charts carefully before picking up his telephone. Within minutes, he was connected to the mayor's office. The receptionist transferred the call after a brief delay, and Richard Collins answered with the distracted tone of someone moving between meetings. "Captain Reed, I thought we already covered this." Marcus remained respectful. "Mr. Mayor, I am requesting one more emergency briefing. The latest observations confirm the storm is strengthening over warmer water. I believe the evacuation order should begin immediately, especially for the neighborhoods along the waterfront." Richard sighed heavily. "Captain, every official forecast I have received says otherwise." Marcus continued without raising his voice. "Forecasts are valuable, but conditions have changed faster than expected. We still have time if we act now." There was a brief silence before the mayor responded. "The festival is already underway. Visitors have filled every hotel in the city. Businesses have invested millions of dollars. I cannot order an evacuation because of a possibility." Marcus answered with complete conviction. "If I am wrong, I will personally accept responsibility for this recommendation." The mayor replied almost instantly. "That will not be necessary, because we are not changing course." The line went silent. Marcus slowly lowered the receiver without showing frustration. Daniel had heard enough from across the room to understand the outcome. "He refused again?" Marcus nodded. "Yes." Elena looked toward the rescue crews already inspecting boats along the docks. "So what do we do now?" Marcus turned toward the operations board where every rescue asset in the station was listed by number and location. His decision came without hesitation. "We prepare as though the storm is coming here." Daniel hesitated. "Even without authorization for emergency deployment?" Marcus looked directly at his young lieutenant. "Preparation does not require permission." Within minutes, the station came alive with quiet determination. Fuel trucks rolled toward rescue vessels. Aviation mechanics inspected Coast Guard helicopters one final time. Medical teams restocked emergency supplies, checked portable generators, and secured additional life jackets inside every response vehicle. No one complained. No one questioned the extra work. They trusted the captain because experience had taught them that he never acted from fear. Outside the station gates, television crews continued broadcasting cheerful images from the waterfront festival. Music drifted across the harbor on the evening breeze, while fireworks crews prepared equipment for the night's celebration. Tourists admired the peaceful ocean glowing beneath the fading sunlight, unaware that farther beyond the horizon the clouds had begun tightening into a darker circle. Marcus stepped onto the pier once more and watched the distant water carefully. The harbor still looked calm enough to reassure anyone searching only with their eyes, but he had long ago learned that the sea often revealed its intentions through details too quiet for most people to notice. As the first cool gust brushed across his face, he whispered almost to himself, "Tomorrow will not ask whether we were ready. It will simply reveal whether we were." By early evening, the air over Charleston no longer felt like the same warm breeze that had welcomed visitors only hours before. The humidity had grown heavier, pressing against every breath, while low clouds quietly gathered beyond the horizon. Inside the Coast Guard station, every rescue crew had finished preparing equipment that they sincerely hoped they would never need. Rescue boats sat fully fueled along the docks. Helicopters were positioned for immediate departure. Medical kits, blankets, portable lights, and emergency food supplies had been checked twice. Captain Marcus Reed walked slowly through the station, stopping at each crew without offering dramatic speeches. He simply nodded, asked a few quiet questions, and made certain everyone understood their assignments. His confidence spread through the room more effectively than any loud command ever could. Lieutenant Daniel Brooks approached with another update in his hand. "Captain, the city has released another public statement. They are encouraging everyone to enjoy the festival and saying conditions remain stable." Marcus accepted the paper and read it without changing expression. Any change from the weather stations? Daniel shook his head. The offshore buoys are reporting stronger wind shifts now, but the official forecast has not changed. Marcus folded the statement and placed it on the table. The ocean already has. Before anyone could respond, Elena Martinez looked toward the television mounted above the operations center. A live broadcast showed Mayor Richard Collins walking through the crowded waterfront festival, shaking hands with business owners while smiling for photographers. Bright lights reflected across the harbor. Live music filled the air. Families applauded as children pointed toward colorful decorations dancing in the evening breeze. One reporter asked, "Mr. Mayor, some residents remain concerned after Captain Reed's warning earlier today. What would you say to them?" Richard answered confidently enough for every television in Charleston to carry his words. "I would tell them to enjoy this beautiful evening. Charleston has prepared responsibly, and our emergency agencies are fully capable of responding if necessary. We cannot allow fear to dictate every decision." Another reporter smiled before asking, "Do you still disagree with Captain Reed's assessment?" Richard paused for only a second. "Captain Reed is undoubtedly experienced in rescue operations, but emergency policy must rely on broader scientific guidance. One person's opinion should never outweigh the consensus of experts." Several officials standing nearby nodded in agreement. The interview quickly spread across social media, where short video clips collected thousands of comments within minutes. Some people praised the mayor for remaining calm. Others mocked Marcus, calling him overly cautious and dramatic. Daniel quietly turned off the television once again. "That cannot be easy to watch," he said. Marcus looked out the operations center window toward the darkening harbor instead of answering immediately. Finally, he spoke in the same steady voice his crew had come to trust. "Pride never changes the weather." Just then, the station radio interrupted the silence with a routine transmission from a small Coast Guard patrol several miles offshore. "Station Charleston, this is Patrol 4. We are observing unusual wave patterns and increasing crosswinds. Visibility remains good, but sea conditions are changing faster than forecast." Marcus stepped to the microphone. "Patrol 4, continue monitoring and report every 15 minutes. Return immediately if conditions worsen." "Understood, Captain." The transmission ended, leaving only the quiet hum of equipment inside the operations room. Outside, twilight settled across the harbor as the festival continued without interruption. Fireworks crews prepared launch equipment, while musicians welcomed larger crowds gathering near the waterfront stage. Restaurants remained full. Ferries continued carrying passengers across the harbor. Everything appeared perfectly normal, yet the first distant roll of thunder drifted across the Atlantic, soft enough that most people mistook it for passing traffic. Marcus stepped outside onto the pier alone. The water reflected almost no stars now because a growing blanket of clouds had quietly covered the sky. He noticed the tide rising faster than expected, lifting the dock lines until they stretched tight against the pilings. A cool gust crossed the harbor, carrying the unmistakable scent of rain long before the first drop had fallen. Daniel joined him moments later. "Sir," he asked quietly, "do you ever wish they had listened?" Marcus kept his eyes fixed on the dark horizon where sea and sky had almost disappeared into one shadow. "I stopped wishing an hour ago," he answered softly. "Now I am simply hoping we prepared enough." Darkness settled over Charleston with surprising speed, as though the evening itself had decided to hold its breath. The bright music from the waterfront festival still drifted across the harbor, but it sounded farther away now, softened beneath a restless wind that no longer followed a familiar rhythm. Captain Marcus Reed remained alone at the end of the pier, his hands resting lightly against the weathered railing while the cold salt air brushed across his face. The harbor lights shimmered across the water, breaking into uneven reflections that stretched and disappeared with every growing swell. For a long moment, he said nothing. Years earlier, he had learned that the ocean often revealed its greatest warnings through silence rather than noise. Lieutenant Daniel Brooks walked toward him without speaking. He stopped several feet away, respecting the quiet that surrounded his captain. Together, they watched the horizon where the last trace of daylight had vanished behind a wall of distant clouds. There was no lightning. There was no dramatic explosion of wind. There was only a strange stillness that felt heavier than any storm Marcus had ever remembered. Daniel finally broke the silence. It feels different tonight. Marcus nodded slowly. The sea is listening. Daniel looked toward the dark water with uncertainty. Listening for what? Marcus kept his eyes fixed on the horizon. For the moment when everything changes, neither man spoke again. Somewhere beyond the harbor, a buoy bell rang once before, disappearing into the wind. The sound echoed across the water like a quiet reminder that nature always moved according to its own timetable. Back inside the operations center, Elena Martinez reviewed the latest reports arriving from offshore monitoring stations. Every update showed only small changes. Wind direction had shifted a few more degrees. Water temperatures remained unusually warm. Barometric pressure continued falling one fraction at a time. None of the numbers appeared alarming by themselves, yet together they formed the same pattern Marcus had recognized hours earlier. Elena stepped outside carrying a fresh printout. "Captain," the pressure dropped again. Marcus accepted the report and studied it beneath the dock lights. He folded the paper carefully before slipping it into his jacket pocket. "Thank you." Elena hesitated. "Do you think anyone at City Hall is looking at these updates?" Marcus answered gently. "I hope someone is." Across downtown Charleston, thousands of visitors continued enjoying the evening without realizing how subtly the city had changed around them. Restaurant patios remained full. Couples walked beside the waterfront holding warm cups of coffee against the cool breeze. Street musicians continued performing beneath decorative lights, while children laughed as they chased one another through the open plaza. The celebration had become part of the city's heartbeat, and almost no one noticed that the flags lining the harbor had begun fluttering toward a different direction than they had only an hour before. High above the streets, Mayor Richard Collins stood inside his office overlooking the waterfront. The festival lights sparkled beneath him like a sea of stars. His communications advisor entered quietly. "The latest interview is receiving positive coverage," she said. "People appreciate your confidence." Richard nodded with satisfaction before glancing toward the harbor. "Good. That is exactly what the city needs tonight." She paused before asking, "Should we check with the Coast Guard again?" Richard looked back toward his desk. "There is nothing new to discuss." Miles away, Marcus slowly removed his cap as another cool gust crossed the pier. The wind carried a faint scent that every experienced mariner recognized immediately. Rain was still many miles offshore, yet its presence had already arrived. He closed his eyes for just a second, remembering his father's quiet voice from decades earlier. "When the birds leave before sunrise and the wind forgets its direction, never argue with the ocean." Marcus opened his eyes and watched the last few seabirds disappear inland, their silhouettes fading into the darkness above the city. He reached for the portable radio clipped to his jacket and spoke with calm certainty. "Operations. This is Captain Reed. Wake every off-duty crew member. I want the entire station fully staffed before midnight." Daniel looked at him. "Sir, nothing has happened yet." Marcus gave one slow nod. "Exactly. This is the last quiet moment we are going to have." At 1:47 inches the morning, the first emergency alarm echoed through the Coast Guard station before anyone inside had time to look at a weather screen. The sharp tone cut through the silence, followed almost immediately by another, then another, until every radio channel came alive at once. Captain Marcus Reed reached the operations center in seconds as dispatchers hurried from one console to another. Elena Martinez looked up from her headset, her voice calm despite the flood of incoming calls. "Captain, offshore buoy 7 just reported an abrupt shift. The eye has turned northwest." Marcus walked straight to the digital map. The newest satellite image appeared on the screen, and for the first time all night the storm no longer followed the official forecast. The massive spiral had curved directly toward Charleston Harbor. Daniel Brooks stared at the display without speaking. Finally he whispered, "You were right." Marcus did not answer. There was no satisfaction on his face, only quiet determination. "Sound full deployment," he ordered. "Launch every rescue team." Throughout the station, lights illuminated every corridor as crew members rushed toward their assignments with disciplined precision. Helicopter crews completed final inspections in record time, while rescue boat engines came to life one after another, their steady rumble rolling across the harbor before sunrise. Outside the station, the wind intensified with startling speed. Rain began as scattered drops against the docks before becoming a steady curtain that blurred the distant shoreline. Across Charleston, the waterfront festival had ended hours earlier, but thousands of visitors remained inside hotels, restaurants, and homes along the coast. Most had gone to bed believing the storm would stay offshore. They woke instead to emergency alerts, sounding across their phones and televisions. At City Hall, Mayor Richard Collins stood frozen before the same weather map he had dismissed only hours earlier. Emergency management officials filled the room, speaking over one another as new reports arrived almost every minute. Power outages are spreading through the Eastern District. Road closures are increasing near the waterfront. The harbor tunnels are beginning to flood. Richard looked toward the operations director. "Begin the evacuation immediately." The director answered with visible concern. "Sir, there is almost no time left. Conditions are deteriorating much faster than expected." Richard lowered his head for a brief moment before asking the question he had spent the entire day avoiding. "Has anyone contacted Captain Reed?" Back at the Coast Guard station, Marcus stood before a large operational map while rescue crews waited for final instructions. His voice remained steady, giving clear assignments without a trace of panic. Rescue Team 1, apartment complexes along East Bay Street. Team 2, the Marina District. Air Crew Alpha, prioritize hospitals and assisted living facilities if transportation becomes limited. Maintain communication every 10 minutes. No unnecessary risks. Everyone comes home together. A chorus of confident replies filled the room. "Yes, Captain, understood. Ready to launch." Within minutes, orange rescue boats moved away from the docks, cutting through dark water illuminated only by navigation lights and distant flashes from transformers failing across the city. Then, almost all at once, Charleston changed. One section of the skyline disappeared into darkness. Seconds later, another block went black. Then another. Streetlights vanished. Office towers lost power. Traffic signals faded until only emergency vehicle lights reflected across rain-covered streets. Daniel watched the skyline through the operations center window. The entire grid is failing. Marcus picked up the radio once more. "All units, citywide power loss confirmed. Continue operations. Watch for floating debris and changing currents." The reply came immediately from the first rescue boat already entering the harbor. "Understood, Captain. We have visual on multiple families, signaling with flashlights from upper floors." Marcus closed his eyes for only a second before opening them again with renewed focus. There would be time later to think about warnings ignored, interviews broadcast, and opportunities lost. Right now, there were only people waiting in the darkness, trusting that someone would come. Without another word, he pulled on his rescue jacket, stepped toward the dock where the final response boat waited against the rising tide, and climbed aboard as the engine carried him directly into the storm he had spent the entire day trying to help the city avoid. For the next several hours, the Coast Guard never stopped moving. Rescue boats crossed flooded streets that had become waterways. Helicopters hovered above dark neighborhoods searching for signals of light, and every radio transmission carried another location where families were waiting with remarkable patience and quiet hope. Captain Marcus Reed stood at the helm of the lead rescue boat, his eyes constantly shifting between the navigation screen and the rows of homes barely visible through the rain. "House on the left," Daniel Brooks called out. "Flashlights in the second-floor window." Marcus eased the boat alongside the porch with calm precision. "Good evening," he called with reassuring confidence. "United States Coast Guard. We are going to take everyone to higher ground." A worried father opened the upstairs window. "We have my mother with us. She cannot move very fast." Marcus smiled gently despite the exhausting night. "That is all right. We are not in a hurry. We are here now." His crew patiently helped every member of the family aboard, making certain blankets were wrapped around the children before the boat continued through the rain. Similar calls filled every hour before dawn. An elderly couple waiting inside a church. Nurses helping patients remain calm inside a neighborhood clinic after the power failed. Hotel guests gathered in quiet hallways with portable flashlights, while Coast Guard crews guided them safely toward evacuation vehicles. No one asked where Captain Reed had been during the press conference. No one questioned the warnings that had been ignored. They simply looked at the orange rescue uniforms with overwhelming relief. Shortly after sunrise, the rain finally began losing its strength. Low gray clouds still covered Charleston, but the strongest winds had moved inland, leaving behind an unfamiliar silence. Emergency vehicles continued working across the city while utility crews inspected damaged power lines. At City Hall, Mayor Richard Collins stood beside the emergency operations staff watching live rescue reports arriving from every district. Nearly every successful mission carried the same signature at the bottom of the screen. United States Coast Guard Charleston. Commanding Officer, Captain Marcus Reed. Richard removed his glasses and rubbed his tired eyes. Hours earlier, he had dismissed the captain before television cameras. Now the city was depending upon the very leader he had refused to believe. Without another word, he asked his driver to take him to the Coast Guard station. When Richard arrived, the rescue operation was still underway. Crew members carried medical supplies toward returning boats, while helicopter teams prepared for another flight farther inland. Marcus stepped onto the dock after completing another evacuation, his uniform soaked from the long night. Yet his expression remained composed. He had barely removed his rescue gloves when he noticed the mayor walking toward him. Several reporters standing nearby immediately turned their cameras in the same direction, sensing that an important moment was about to unfold. Richard stopped only a few feet away. For several long seconds, neither man spoke. The sounds of rescue crews loading equipment and helicopters preparing for departure filled the silence between them. Finally, the mayor slowly removed his official cap and lowered his head. "Captain Reed," he said quietly, "I should have listened to you." Marcus looked at him with the same calm expression he had carried throughout the entire storm. There was no anger in his eyes, no satisfaction, only exhaustion mixed with compassion. Richard continued, his voice becoming heavier with every word. "I questioned your judgment in public. I allowed pride to become louder than experience. Because of that, this city lost precious time." Marcus glanced toward another rescue boat preparing to leave the dock. "Mr. Mayor," he answered gently, "right now the only thing that matters is making sure every family gets home safely." Richard looked around at the men and women working beside Marcus without complaint despite the long night. He realized none of them had paused to celebrate being right. They had simply continued serving complete strangers. The mayor turned toward the gathered reporters. Speaking clearly enough for every camera to hear, he said, "Charleston owes its deepest gratitude to Captain Marcus Reed and every member of the United States Coast Guard. Their preparation, professionalism, and courage protected this city when leadership, including my own, failed to recognize the danger in time." Marcus quietly shook his head. "Do not thank me alone," he replied. "Thank the crew. No one rescues a city by themselves." 1 year later, the morning sun rose gently over Charleston Harbor, casting soft golden light across calm water that reflected the city with quiet dignity. The scars left by the hurricane had long been repaired. Streets were busy again, restaurants welcomed visitors, children played beside the waterfront, and fishing boats returned each dawn just as they had for generations. Life had moved forward, yet the people of Charleston had not forgotten the night when everything changed. Near the harbor stood a newly completed memorial, unlike any monument the city had ever dedicated. There was no towering statue of a politician, no grand pedestal honoring a single individual. Instead, a bronze sculpture showed several Coast Guard rescuers reaching together toward a small child, reminding every visitor that courage was never the work of one person alone. At the base of the memorial, a simple inscription read, "Leadership begins with listening. Service begins with compassion." Families stopped throughout the day to read those words before quietly continuing their walk along the waterfront. Captain Marcus Reed arrived early that morning wearing the same Coast Guard uniform he had worn for countless years. There were no cameras waiting for him. No reporters asked for interviews. He preferred it that way. He stood for several silent moments, looking at the memorial before placing one hand lightly against the cool bronze. Lieutenant Daniel Brooks joined him carrying 2 cups of coffee. "I still cannot believe they built this," Daniel said with a smile. Marcus accepted the coffee and looked toward the harbor where rescue boats moved peacefully across the calm water. "They did not build it for us," he replied. "They built it so people remember what matters before the next storm comes." Daniel nodded thoughtfully. "I have been thinking about that night a lot." Marcus smiled gently. "So have I." Across the harbor, Mayor Richard Collins walked slowly toward the memorial, carrying no prepared speech and no group of advisors. The events of the previous year had changed him in ways no election ever could. He had introduced new emergency planning procedures, expanded cooperation between city leaders and first responders, and required that experienced rescue professionals be included in every major disaster decision. More importantly, he had learned that true leadership demanded humility long before emergencies arrived. Richard stopped beside Marcus and extended his hand. "Good morning, Captain." Marcus shook it warmly. "Good morning, Mr. Mayor." Richard looked at the bronze figures before speaking again. "Every time I see this memorial, I remember how close we came to making an even greater mistake." Marcus followed his gaze. "Every community learns its lessons differently." Richard took a slow breath. "I only wish ours had not come at such a high price." Marcus answered quietly. "The important thing is that we learned." They stood together without another word, listening to the gentle sound of waves touching the seawall. Nearby, children laughed as they watched a Coast Guard helicopter pass overhead during a routine training flight. One little boy pointed excitedly toward the aircraft before asking his father, "Do those people help everyone?" His father smiled. "Yes, that is exactly what they do." Marcus heard the conversation and lowered his eyes for a moment, grateful that the child had not asked what anyone looked like, where they came from, or who had received the credit. He had simply asked who was willing to help. A light breeze carried the familiar scent of salt water across the harbor, as the American flag outside the Coast Guard station rose steadily against a clear blue sky. The ocean looked peaceful once again, hiding the memory of the storm beneath its quiet surface. Yet everyone who had lived through that night understood something they could never forget. Pride could silence wisdom for a moment, but truth always returned with the tide, and kindness possessed a strength that no position, no title, and no prejudice could ever overcome. Marcus adjusted his cap, smiled at his crew preparing another ordinary day of service, and walked back toward the waiting rescue boats as the morning light stretched across the water, leaving behind nothing but the calm, enduring silence of justice.